Hi everyone. So, as I'm sure that you have seen from the announcements, this week we are going to do something different. And I will discuss why and how that translates to our sessions in just a second. But first, I want to state for the record that this is a recording of how to tackle the lab for week 6 when we look at the blood vessels. And in this lab in particular, we will be looking at the pulse, where and how to measure it, and what sort of a thing can affect it. Like I said, I had to do a little moving around stuff for this week's sessions. This is because unfortunately I am unable to spend time with you in person on our usual Tuesday afternoon session. So there is no in-person class on the coming Tuesday. This is because, unfortunately, I am double booked for this time. Instead, what you will be doing is that you will be completing a virtual lab independently. And that is exactly why I have created this video to help you to work through it. So as always, you will have all the assistance and support available to you as you would have in an in-person lab. I've got you. I am here to help. And then, as I shared in the class and on my announcement, we go through the lecture material on Wednesday in our live online class. So you will still get all the same experience of teaching. It will be just more virtual. And whatever we do not get through together on Wednesday, I will look through it with you in class on Thursday afternoon. This is also our chance to review any questions that you may have about this virtual lab. Oh, and this virtual lab will be your lab submission for this week. So I have changed what was supposed to be our in-person lab to this virtual one. I wanted to start with a few intended learning outcomes. First of all, pulse, which is what we will be studying in this lab, is an important measure that we can use to get a lot of information about what is going on in your body. So if we want to define what it is that bumping sensation that we feel when we place a finger on someone's artery and detect that it expands and then shrinks again. And this expansion that we detect is taking place when the ventricles contract and push the blood out of the heart to the circulation. So this forceful contraction of blood out from where the heart is, what we feel here. And there are many arteries that we can look at to detect the pulse from. Usually we go and pick ones that are most easily accessible for us, but it does not mean that there would not be other options. I also wanted to talk about the fact that since what we feel as a pulse was what we can detect when the blood is pushed out of the heart with each heartbeat, well, consequently, pulse rate can be used as one way of how we measure the heart rate. So pulse rate tells us a number of how many times in a minute the heart contracts. Finally, I wanted to make a point that many things can influence your pulse rate. These include your body's position, how active you are, so how hard have you been working, and in this way, how hard your heart has been working, and also your emotional state can play a role. Okay, before we get started, I wanted to revise a few important concepts so that we are good to go. The reason why heart rate is so useful for us is that by determining one's heart rate, we can actually evaluate one's individual health. Heart rate determines how much blood the heart pumps out in a given amount of time, and this is typically in a minute. So really, therefore, this tells us the amount of blood delivered to the tissues in the body. So if nothing else, I hope that you join me in agreeing that this sounds kind of a useful thing to do, right? Well, what we do in this lab and in this review too is that we will look at the different locations from where we can get the pulse rate. We will also measure the pulse rate from different arteries and then compare these measurements. One thing that we will be interested in is going to be the relative intensity of the pulse at different arteries. We will be also comparing the pulse rate in various positions, while sitting down, lying flat, and while standing. Finally, not only different positions, but also in different conditions, while at rest and while or immediately after exercising. So we should be able to find out a lot of interesting things about the pulse. The reason why I have included this slide is that I think it is such a good one when it comes to visualizing what happens, what is taking place when we feel the pulse from your artery. So as you can see, during the time when your ventricles of the heart are in diastole, so relaxed, there is no blood being pushed out of the heart into these arteries. So they are just at their normal size as the blood vessels with their resting diameter. However, when the ventricles contract, so are in systole, they push blood out from the heart. And this happens with some force. And because there is all this blood being pushed out powerfully, arteries must stretch to facilitate this sudden burst of blood. So they get physically thicker, stretched. And this is what we feel when we feel the pulse from the artery. It is getting larger in diameter due to the blood rushing out from the heart. What I want to do next is to look at some of the most common arterial locations where we can measure the pulse from. You will notice that some of these are probably more familiar ones to you, while others may be ones that we use less frequently. However, it is important that you know that these are options too. Let's start with the common carotid artery. This is located at the side of the neck on both sides. And as we look at the major arteries of the body, we will notice that the one on the right side, this arises as a branch of brachiocephalic artery from the aorta. So it is very close to the heart. So definitely a good spot to get a strong pulse from. And of course, on the left side of the body, it is a branch of an aorta. So again, very close to the heart, so strong pulse can be found here. Another one that I think that we use very often is brachial artery. This can be used for finding the pulse, especially at the area in front of an elbow. The proper anatomical term for this area is, of course, antecubital region. So this area where we often draw blood from too. Next, another very common spot for finding a pulse is radial artery. So for taking a pulse from this, you would go to the wrist and to the thumb side of it. One mnemonic that some of my students use is that they say right on for radius while showing their thumbs up. So radial artery is on the thumb side. Ulnar then would be on the pinky side. Next one I have listed here is your femoral artery. This can be found for taking the pulse from the groin region. To use proper anatomical language for the body regions, we would call this inguinal region, right? Obviously, we do not tend to use this terribly a lot of, as this is a rather private region, but it is an area that is an option if needed. Okay, next I have listed popliteal artery. Please note that this would be on the posterior side, so on the back side. This is why I have marked it with an arrow on this picture. To find the popliteal artery pulse, you would go to the back of the knee, easily accessible area. The next two ones are typically less used ones, but nonetheless options that we have. So posterior tibial artery runs on the medial side, so on the middle facing side of the ankle. To find a pulse from this, you would go between the medial side and Achilles tendon. Let's use a little more accurate anatomical language. So between medial malleus and calcaneal tendon. Last one that I have listed here is the dorsal pedis artery. This is at the top of the foot. So to get the pulse from here, you would palpate on top or dorsum of the foot. So here we have some of the most common pulse points. I hope that you found this useful to go through them. And in fact, in this virtual lab activity that you will be completing, you should be able to identify these. Next, just as a quick thing that I wanted to mention, the lab will ask you to come up with few hypotheses regarding the things that we will find information about as we work further into the lab. Remember, it is not a big deal if your hypothesis turns out to be incorrect. What matters, though, is that you have some reasonable rationale that you base your hypothesis on. What you will do as your first actual step of this experiment is that you will take a pulse, albeit virtually, from 3 different locations. These locations of the subject are common carotid artery, brachial artery, and radial artery pulse points. So that is why it is important that you know where to find these spots. Another thing that I want you to note is that what it is exactly that I ask you to measure. Well, there are 2 things that I'm hoping you to make a note for each of these spots. First of all, we will look at the intensity of the pulse at these 3 locations. Note how close are each at the different distance from the heart. So one of the common carotid is really close. One, the radial one, really far away from the heart. As far as we can go on the upper limb, really. So I'm interested in you observing if the pulse is felt strong at each of these spots. That is the first thing that I want you to make a note of for each of these. The second one is, probably not surprisingly, taking the pulse rate from each of these sites. How we do it is, though, a little different from what we have done previously in this class. Remember, I told you that you should measure the pulse for a full duration of a minute. So 60 seconds to get a pulse rate as beats per minute. It turns out though that in a clinical practice we often do not have enough time to do this for a full minute. Instead, you can measure the pulse for 30 or 15 seconds and then multiply your result by 2 or 4 respectively. And that is what you do in this lab. Personally, I do think that there is a little more of a risk of introducing an error when doing it in this way. So I tell my students to do the full minute, but the reality is that this is what gets done in the real world in the field. So what do you do with all this information? Well, actually at the lab software, at the bottom of the screen, you will see a button called Lab Data. When you click on it, a screen like this will open up, and this is where you will fill in your observations. You will see that I have given you the differences on the relative intensity here, but blurred out the rest. So you will be filling in your observations here throughout the lab. Okay, what we are going to do next in this lab is that we are going to look at the effect of the amount of physical activity on the pulse rate. So to start with, we will take the pulse rate from brachial artery while sitting normally. Then we will repeat the same, but now with the subject laying down. One thing to notice here is that we measure these immediately and then 5 minutes after the change. You might ask that why do we wait for 5 minutes? Well, it takes a while for your body to catch up with the change that has been made, so that's why. We want to see what effect the condition had after we have had a chance to adjust it. And again, your records for the results would be put into the lab data notes. We repeat the same thing, but this time, rather than laying down, we will have the subject standing up. So we are interested in what kind of an effect would this have on the pulse rate. And finally, we have the subject to exercise and see what effect that would have on the pulse rate. Let's wrap up this lab. Now that you have done all these measurements, you have your lab data notes to refer back to as you tackle the lab wrap-up questions. Well, first of all, we end up finding that the closer you are to the heart, the stronger the pulse is. And secondly, we will note that the largest effect that we saw in the change of body position was when going from sitting to standing up. Now that you have completed the lab, the score for it will be automatically updated on Canvas. So you do not need to submit a lab report to me. All this happens automatically as I have synced the publisher's website with our course. Make sure to complete the lab on time before the deadline. Also, you will have unlimited attempts to complete this lab, so if you want to go back there, do not hesitate to do so. Thanks for completing this lab in a virtual format. I appreciate you doing so. And on Wednesday, we'll return back to the normal on this class. Until then, bye-bye.